February 14th, 1983. A guitar solo, lasting barely 20 seconds, shattered a wall that American radio had spent decades building. Eddie Van Halen's blistering performance on Beat It didn't just make rock history, it forced white rock stations across America to play a black artist they'd been systematically excluding for years. This is the story of how one song destroyed radio segregation and changed popular music forever. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth about American radio in the early 80s. The music industry operated under apartheid, not official policy written on paper, but something arguably worse, an unspoken agreement that black artists belonged on urban contemporary stations, while white artists owned rock radio. Album-oriented rock stations, known as AOR, dominated FM frequencies across the country. These weren't fringe operations. They were mainstream, powerful, profitable stations in every major market from New York to Los Angeles. And they had an unofficial rule: no black faces, no matter how talented. The Black Music Association, a trade organization representing African American musicians and industry professionals, publicly condemned AOR programming in the early 80s. They pointed out what everyone could hear but nobody wanted to admit. These stations played Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Aerosmith, Van Halen, Journey, and dozens of other predominantly white acts, while systematically ignoring black musicians making rock-oriented music. The AOR programmers had their defense ready. They claimed the exclusion wasn't racist. It was just format purity driven by audience research and demographic data. Their listeners, they insisted, wanted a specific sound. Pure rock, no R&B crossover, no funk influences, certainly no disco remnants. This reasoning was garbage, and here's why. Rock music itself was built on black American music. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. These black pioneers created the foundation that white British bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones built their careers on. The blues, which gave birth to rock, came directly from black communities in the American South. So when AOR stations claimed their format excluded black artists because of musical differences, they were essentially saying they'd take the music but not the people who invented it. By 1982, the separation was complete. Quincy Jones watched this industry-wide segregation with growing frustration. He'd produced Off the Wall for Michael Jackson in 1979, and despite selling 10 million copies and producing 4 top 10 singles, the album received minimal rock radio airplay. Michael was pigeonholed as an R&B artist, no matter how pop his sound became. His music played on urban contemporary stations. White pop stations gave him some rotation, but rock stations, they acted like he didn't exist. Quincy understood the math. If Michael wanted to become the biggest artist in the world, not just a successful black performer, he needed rock audiences. That meant rock radio. And rock radio had made clear they weren't interested unless something fundamental changed. So during the Thriller sessions in 1982, Quincy gave Michael an assignment that would alter music history. He told him to write a black version of My Sharona by The Knack, a white rock band whose 1979 hit had dominated both pop and rock formats. Michael took the challenge seriously. He'd grown up on Motown, smooth soul and polished pop. Writing aggressive rock wasn't natural for him. But he understood what Quincy was asking: create something so undeniably rock that stations calling themselves rock radio would have no excuse to refuse it. The result was Beat It, a song Michael composed entirely in his head before bringing a demo to Westlake Recording Studios. The message, avoid gang violence, walk away from pointless fights, came from Michael's genuine concerns about street violence affecting young people. But the musical approach was calculated. This wasn't another smooth ballad or funk groove. This was meant to hit hard. Quincy assembled an elite team. Steve Lukather from the rock band Toto played the rhythm guitar and bass. Jeff Porcaro, also from Toto, handled drums. The synclavier synthesizer provided that metallic opening riff. Michael recorded vocals with his characteristic precision, doing dozens of takes until every syllable sounded exactly right. But Quincy knew they needed something more. The track was good, maybe even great, but good wasn't enough to force rock radio's hand. They needed authentication, a stamp of approval from the rock community that would make the song impossible to ignore. That's when Quincy picked up the phone and called Eddie Van Halen. In 1982, Eddie was arguably the most famous rock guitarist on the planet. His band Van Halen had released their fifth album Diver Down that year, and their innovative sound dominated rock radio. Eddie's finger-tapping technique had revolutionized guitar playing. He'd built his own guitars, developed his own tone, created his own style. Getting him on a Michael Jackson track would be the ultimate crossover stamp. Eddie initially thought the call was a prank. Quincy Jones, the legendary producer, calling him to work on a pop record? It seemed absurd. Quincy called back and convinced him it was legitimate. Eddie agreed to come to the studio, but he had conditions that revealed his character. First, he'd do it for free, as a favor, because he respected the music. Second, he didn't want credit on the album cover, because his Van Halen bandmates might object to him working outside the group. When Eddie arrived at the studio, Michael wasn't even there. The engineer played him the track, and Eddie listened with the critical ear of someone who understood song structure intimately. He didn't like what he heard, not because the song was bad, but because the middle section felt too rigid for a proper guitar solo. So Eddie, without asking permission, told the engineer to get the tape and a razor blade. They physically cut the tape and rearranged the song structure, creating space for the solo Eddie envisioned. When Michael returned and heard what Eddie had done, he could have been furious. This outsider had literally cut up his carefully crafted song. Instead, Michael was thrilled. He recognized that Eddie cared enough about the music to make it better, rather than just showing up and performing. That mutual respect between two masters of their crafts produced something neither could have created alone. Eddie plugged in his homemade Frankenstrat guitar and a rented amplifier he'd borrowed from guitarist Alan Holdsworth. He recorded 2 takes. That's it. 2 passes at the solo, and they had what they needed. The performance lasted about 20 seconds, but what Eddie packed into those seconds changed everything. The finger-tapping technique he'd pioneered exploded through the speakers. Dive bombs and squeals that were pure Van Halen's signature sound. Energy so intense that, according to session musicians present, one of the studio monitor speakers actually caught fire and blew out just as Eddie finished his last note. There's an urban legend that needs addressing here. Some say Eddie was drunk and angry during the session, that the knocking sound before his solo came from him banging on equipment in frustration. Complete fiction. The knocking noise at 2 minutes and 45 seconds into the song was Michael Jackson banging on a drum case. He's even credited on Thriller as drum case beater. Eddie showed up professional, did his work brilliantly, and left. The whole session took about 20 minutes. Steve Lukather, who'd played all the other guitar parts on the track, later reflected on what happened next. Quincy heard Eddie's solo and decided it was too aggressive, too heavy for what they'd planned. So they remixed the track, pulling Eddie's guitar back in the mix, softening its impact. But even toned down, the Van Halen DNA was undeniable. Anyone with working ears could tell the greatest rock guitarist alive had played on this song. Beat It was released February 14, 1983. Epic Records vice president Frank DeLeo, who'd later become Michael's manager, insisted they drop the single while Billie Jean was still climbing toward #1. DeLeo correctly predicted both songs could coexist in the top 10 simultaneously. What he might not have predicted was how Beat It would accomplish what no other Michael Jackson song had managed: forcing rock radio to play it. Program directors at AOR stations across the country faced an impossible situation. Their format claimed to play rock music. Beat It was undeniably rock music. It had the aggressive guitar work. It had the hard-driving beat. It had Eddie Van Halen's guitar solo providing absolute rock credibility. If they refused to play it, they'd be admitting their format purity argument was really just coded racism. Some stations tried to resist initially, but as the song exploded on pop and R&B charts, climbing toward #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the pressure became unbearable. Their listeners called requesting it. Their advertisers noticed the song's massive popularity. Other rock stations in competing markets started adding it to rotation and gaining audience share. By April 1983, Beat It had reached #14 on Billboard's Top Tracks chart. which specifically measured AOR station airplay. Number 14 might not sound revolutionary until you realize this was the first time many of these stations had played Michael Jackson at all. Some had never played any black artist in their entire existence. The barrier wasn't just cracked, it was blown apart. Eddie Van Halen himself experienced the cultural shift firsthand. He was standing in line at Tower Records in Sherman Oaks when Beat It came on the store's sound system. Kids in front of him started commenting, listening to the solo. One said, "Listen to this guy trying to sound like Eddie Van Halen." Eddie tapped him on the shoulder and said, "That is me." The kid's face was probably priceless. But Beat It didn't just conquer rock radio. It exposed the hypocrisy at MTV, which was operating under similar racial restrictions. MTV had launched in August 1981 with an explicit album-oriented rock format. They claimed to be a rock video channel, which conveniently meant they played almost exclusively white artists. Black musicians were told their videos didn't fit the format. Rick James, who'd made a video for Super Freak, was rejected. His anger at the exclusion led him to publicly accuse MTV of racism. David Bowie, during a 1983 interview with MTV's VJ Mark Goodman, challenged the network's lack of diversity on camera. The exchange is uncomfortable to watch even decades later. Goodman tried to defend MTV by saying they had to consider what viewers in the Midwest would want to see, implying that showing black artists would scare white audiences. Bowie's face showed exactly what he thought of that excuse. Michael Jackson had faced the same MTV resistance. Walter Yetnikoff, president of CBS Records Group, had to literally threaten to pull all CBS artists from the channel before they'd agree to play the Billie Jean video. That video, released in January 1983, broke the color barrier at MTV. Michael became the first black artist in heavy rotation on the network. But Billie Jean was still categorized as pop, still somewhat easy for MTV to segregate mentally as not really rock. Then Beat It arrived, with its leather jackets, its gang choreography, its Eddie Van Halen guitar solo, and its undeniable rock credibility. MTV couldn't hide behind format excuses anymore. The video went into heavy rotation, and the floodgates began opening for other black artists. Prince's Little Red Corvette and 1999 got airtime. Eddie Grant's Electric Avenue entered rotation. Interestingly, all three songs, Beat It, Little Red Corvette, and Electric Avenue, debuted on Billboard's Top Tracks chart the same week in April 1983. The timing wasn't coincidental. Beat It had proven that black artists could succeed on rock radio and rock video formats. The excuse that audiences wouldn't accept it had been demolished. Now, let's be clear about something. Beat It didn't immediately transform American radio into a racial utopia. The Black Rock Coalition, formed in 1987, still felt compelled to label AOR as apartheid-oriented radio because of continued resistance to black rock artists. Throughout the remainder of the 80s, only a handful of black musicians managed consistent AOR airplay. Prince, Living Colour, Lenny Kravitz, Tracy Chapman. The door had been cracked open, not blown off its hinges. But that crack mattered. Before Beat It, the door had been welded shut. Michael Jackson won 2 Grammy Awards for the song in 1984. Record of the Year and Best Male Rock Vocal Performance. That second category is significant. Rock Vocal Performance. The Recording Academy, which had categorized him as purely R&B for Off the Wall, now acknowledged him as a rock artist. The Grammy voters could read the charts as clearly as anyone else. Beat It had dominated rock radio whether the format wanted it to or not. The song's music video, directed by Bob Giraldi and featuring actual Los Angeles gang members from the Crips and Bloods, became one of the most iconic clips of the MTV era. Michael broke up a gang fight through dance, turning violence into choreography. The message aligned perfectly with the lyrics. Walk away from pointless confrontation. Don't try to prove your manhood through fighting. But the subtext was equally powerful. A black artist was commanding MTV's airwaves with a video that looked nothing like the hair metal and new wave content dominating the channel. Weird Al Yankovic's parody Eat It became a massive hit in its own right, cementing Beat It as a cultural phenomenon beyond just music. When Weird Al parodies your song, you've penetrated deep into American consciousness. The parody introduced Beat It to people who might never listen to rock or pop radio, spreading its influence even further. The strategic brilliance of Beat It extended beyond just musical choices. Michael and Quincy understood that breaking racial barriers required more than talent. It required making the exclusion indefensible. By recruiting Eddie Van Halen, they created a situation where rock radio couldn't claim the song wasn't rock enough. By making the track genuinely aggressive and guitar-driven, they eliminated the too-pop excuse. By releasing it at the peak of Thriller's commercial explosion, they made ignoring it economically stupid for stations trying to maintain ratings. Every objection was systematically destroyed before it could gain traction. The collaboration between Michael and Eddie also demonstrated something beautiful about music, when egos and racial divisions step aside. Eddie didn't need the money. He was already wealthy and successful. He didn't need the exposure. Van Halen was one of the biggest bands in the world. He did it because the music interested him, because he respected Quincy and Michael's artistry, and because great musicians recognize greatness regardless of genre boundaries. His willingness to rearrange the song's structure without asking permission first showed he approached the collaboration as a peer, not as a hired session player. Michael's appreciation for that creative input showed he valued musical excellence over ego protection. Thriller sold 70 million copies worldwide and spent 37 weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200. Beat It was crucial to that success not just for its sales, but for what it represented. The album crossed every demographic barrier that existed in 1980s America: race, age, geography, musical preference. You could find Thriller in suburbs and inner cities, being played by teenagers and their parents, dominating pop stations, R&B stations, and after Beat It, even rock stations. That kind of universal appeal was unprecedented and hasn't been replicated since. The song proves something essential about American music segregation. It was always about race, never about sound. When white radio programmers and executives claimed they couldn't play black artists because of format differences, they were lying. The format was fine with black musical innovations as long as white musicians performed them. Led Zeppelin built a career on blues riffs created by black musicians, but AOR stations wouldn't play those same black blues artists. The Rolling Stones covered Chuck Berry and played Chuck's style of rock, but stations wouldn't add Chuck to rotation. The hypocrisy was blatant once you looked at it directly. Beat It forced everyone to look directly. Eddie Van Halen's participation made the double standard impossible to maintain. If the greatest white rock guitarist alive endorsed this black artist by playing on his record, what excuse did rock radio have for refusing? None that they could state publicly without admitting racial bias. So they played it. Begrudgingly in some cases, enthusiastically in others, but they played it. And once they'd broken their own unwritten rule, the absolute nature of the barrier weakened. The impact rippled forward. Would Run DMC and Aerosmith's collaboration on Walk This Way have happened in 1986 if Beat It hadn't broken ground 3 years earlier? Would MTV have embraced hip-hop the way they eventually did? Would rock radio have given Living Colour a chance when they emerged in the late 80s? We can't know alternate history, but the timeline suggests Beat It created space for future crossovers that might not have existed otherwise. Michael never stopped fighting against industry segregation. Later collaborations with Slash on Black or White and Give In To Me, with Carlos Santana, with heavy rock production on tracks like Dirty Diana. All of these continued the work that Beat It started. He understood that his success created opportunities for other black artists, and he weaponized his commercial power to force format changes the industry resisted. It's worth noting that Michael wrote Beat It himself. Quincy produced it brilliantly, assembled the perfect musicians, made crucial decisions about arrangement and mixing, but the core song, melody, lyrics, structure, came from Michael's compositional mind. This matters because critics sometimes portrayed him as purely a performer, someone who sang other people's songs and danced brilliantly. Beat It proved he was a songwriter sophisticated enough to craft a rock anthem that could stand alongside anything Van Halen or Journey released that year. The song's longevity speaks to its quality. 40 years after its release, Beat It still plays at sporting events, still appears in movie soundtracks, still gets covered by rock bands. Classic rock stations that finally added it to rotation in 1983 still play it today. It's become a permanent part of the rock canon, which would have seemed impossible in 1982 when AOR stations were systematically excluding Michael Jackson from their playlists. February 14, 1983. A guitar solo lasting barely 20 seconds proved that American radio segregation was a choice, not an inevitability. Eddie Van Halen's blistering performance forced rock stations to either play Michael Jackson or admit their format restrictions were really racial restrictions. They chose to play it. And once they'd made that choice, the absolute nature of the color barrier crumbled. Not immediately, not completely, but irreversibly. That's the power of great art coupled with strategic thinking. Michael and Quincy didn't just make a hit song, they made a weapon against institutionalized racism, and they wielded it with precision.